lots of different options when it comes to choosing handguns. There's different actions that they work on, there's different shapes, there's different sizes. We want to make sure that we're choosing the appropriate one. You know, a lot of these guns up here all shoot 9mm, right? And so if this is shooting 9mm and then something much smaller is shooting 9mm, a lot of people will look at the smaller gun and think, wow, that's the one I want because it's smaller, it's going to be easier to handle. But really, because there's so much more mass on the larger guns, you're going to have less felt recoil with it. So the larger guns are typically going to be easier to handle, easier to shoot, but there's a trade-off there. With the bigger guns, it still has to fit your hand properly. And we talked about in one of the other videos how it's important that the thumb knuckle of your strong hand is all the way on the weak side of the firearm and that you can still reach the controls with the gun. So that's very important. So my hand, because of the size, is going to fit any of the firearms that we have up here on the table, but that's not the case. I've worked with a lot of students that even something like this right here that would be more of considered a medium frame gun, that they struggle to be able to reach the trigger properly when the gun doesn't properly fit the hand. And that's what happens. If you got the thumb knuckle all the way over where the gun is centered up, I still have a lot of room to be able to reach that trigger and still have that gap in between my trigger finger and the gun, allowing me to press that trigger straight back towards the rear. But if I can barely reach that trigger, then what ends up happening is if I can't reach it is I have to turn my hand on the gun to be able to generate more finger length, which then puts the recoil back on the thumb knuckle and joint rather than back coming into my forearm where I can more easily manage that. So it's important that you're choosing one that does work well for you. There are different options with different actions. Like this Derringer here is what's considered a single action revolver. That after you load it, you have to cock the hammer on it, and then when you press the trigger, all it is doing is releasing that hammer. You know, with this type of design, it's going to be less efficient when we're talking about something like personal defense in the way that we work with that. So we want to make sure that we're choosing something that works well for the context of what we're doing. So we've got single action only. You also have double action only, that with each trigger press, it is cocking and releasing a hammer. Now this one you can't see the hammer, but it is completely shrouded. It's internal in the actual firearm, but that's what's happening. As you press the trigger, it cocks and releases that hammer. So you're going to have much longer, heavier trigger presses, with the double actions. With this type of action over here, this is a double action, single action. So after loading the gun and chambering that round, it leaves that hammer cocked back. But for safety purposes, when we're not shooting it, we would want to make sure we're actually using, which is the decock lever on this gun, that when we push this down, it will actually decock that hammer forwards. Notice my finger's not around that trigger, but yet that hammer went forward. So that's a safety control that's built into this gun. So that means your first shot on this firearm actually has to cock and release that hammer, but then all of your subsequent shots after the gun goes off, the hammer's already back. So second, third, fourth shots, until you reset that hammer again, all it is doing is releasing the actual hammer on the trigger press. So with this type of firearm, ultimately, it's going to be more complicated to be able to work with because I have to teach my brain how to work with two different types of triggers because each one requires a different amount of control. Is it my first shot or is it a follow-up shot that I'm working with? So I prefer guns that are more simple design where the trigger press is the same every single time, like the double action only, or like the modern striker-fired semi-automatics that with each press of the trigger, all it is doing is working like that pinball machine that we've previously talked about. You pull the plunger back and it releases forward into the actual primer, or you pull the striker back, the firing pin back on these. So we want to make sure that we're choosing the ones that work well. These two guns are very similar in size, or they are similar in size, but this one is actually chambered in .22 long rifle, where this one is chambered in 9mm. Now, .22 long rifle being much smaller, much less gunpowder, means much less felt recoil. So it could be that you can choose two guns that are similar to one another, but one chambered in something like .22 long rifle, so when ammunition is harder to find or it's more expensive, that you can still get out and get training time. Now, it's not one-to-one on recoil, but it is one-to-one on size. So you still have the ability to be able to use the same holsters if you're talking about carrying the firearm and be able to work through different movements with that. We've got lots of different options that we have with firearms. This one down here on the end, you can see something coming up over the top of it. This has an optic on the front that floats a red dot as you look at the target. So when you drive the gun out and looking at the target, it looks like there's an actual laser beam that's being presented to the actual target itself. So it can be a little bit faster and more efficient if you're shooting targets that are much farther away. So if you're trying to take a 20, 25 yard shot with it, so having that red dot on the firearm can be a little bit more efficient to work with because you're not sitting there trying to change the sight alignment or sight picture and line up multiple objects with the target. You're just putting the dot on the target and you're able to press the trigger. It's not going to make someone a better shooter, it just makes it a little bit more efficient to be able to work with smaller targets or targets that are further away. These two firearms here both fire 9mm. They're both made by the same manufacturer, but this one has a longer barrel and a longer slide, more weight out front. So if you think about the fulcrum point on this firearm, this one's going to be more front end heavy. The benefit to having that longer barrel and more weight out on the front end is going to be for managing recoil. The heavier the front end of that gun is, the easier it is going to be to manage the recoil. So this one, even though they have the same grip size, this one over here is going to feel like it recoils more because it has less weight on the front end. So I like having the longer slides, the longer barrels. There's going to be a benefit to that. I even like having the longer grips as well to make sure that I can get a good purchase on the firearm. Also, having more distance between the rear sight and the front sight makes it a little bit easier when it comes to lining up the sights for those higher precision shots when needed. So in the end, you want to make sure that you're choosing something that does work well for the context of use. Understand there's lots of different options that we have available to us, but we want to choose the one that's going to work the best for what we need it for.